In the final months of the 1960s, as American performance reached its mechanical peak, one production car left the factory carrying capabilities that would soon become impossible to repeat. It was not announced as a farewell, and it was not designed to mark the end of an era. Yet, when viewed in hindsight, it sits precisely at the boundary between two regulatory worlds. Everything that followed would be built under a different set of assumptions, limitations, and priorities. Understanding why this car mattered requires understanding what the rules allowed just before they changed, and what they would no longer permit afterward. By 1969, the American performance car existed in an environment that had developed gradually since the mid-1950s. Fuel was inexpensive, federal emissions oversight was minimal, and manufacturers faced few direct constraints on displacement, compression ratio, or exhaust output. Horsepower ratings were still quoted using the SAE gross method, measured on an engine stand without accessories, air filters, or exhaust restrictions. Insurance companies had begun to take notice of rising accident claims, but their influence was uneven and not yet coordinated. Within this space, manufacturers competed primarily on straight-line acceleration, torque output, and engine size, often placing their largest engines into intermediate-size platforms that balanced weight and traction more effectively than full-size cars. General Motors' internal policy nominally restricted engines larger than 400 cubic inches to full-size vehicles. But by the late 1960s, this rule had been repeatedly bent or circumvented. Chevrolet, in particular, used the Chevelle as its primary performance intermediate, positioning it between the compact Nova and the full-size Impala. The Chevelle's chassis offered a wheelbase of 112 inches, a curb weight that could be kept under 3,700 pounds in performance trim, and sufficient engine bay space to accept Chevrolet's largest big block V8s. It was into this context that the 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 was introduced. The Chevelle SS had existed since 1964, but the 1970 model year represented its most extreme form. The car was offered with two versions of the 454 cubic inch V8, the LS5 and the LS6. The LS5 was rated at 360 horsepower, while the LS6 carried an advertised rating of 450 horsepower at 5,600 RPM and 500 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 RPM. Both figures were quoted as SAE gross, but even allowing for rating inflation, the LS6 stood apart. It used a forged steel crankshaft, forged aluminum pistons, rectangular port cylinder heads, a high-lift solid lifter camshaft, and an 11.25:1 compression ratio. Fuel was supplied by a Holley 4-barrel carburetor rated at 800 CFM, and ignition timing was aggressive by later standards. The purpose of the LS6 Chevelle was not subtle. It was built to dominate quarter-mile performance within a product range that already included the Camaro, Corvette, and Nova. Chevrolet engineers understood that traction, gearing, and vehicle weight were as important as peak output, which is why the LS6 was paired with close-ratio manual transmissions and heavy-duty rear axles. Period road tests recorded quarter-mile times in the low 13-second range on street tires, with trap speeds exceeding 105 miles per hour. These numbers were achieved without electronic engine management, catalytic converters, or exhaust restrictions beyond basic mufflers. The buyer Chevrolet envisioned was not a general commuter, but an enthusiast who valued acceleration above refinement. The LS6 option significantly increased the car's price and was ordered in relatively small numbers. Fewer than 4,500 LS6 Chevelles were produced in 1970, according to Chevrolet production records. The car was never intended to be a high-volume seller. Instead, it served as a statement of what Chevrolet could engineer within the regulatory and economic environment of the time. That environment, however, was already beginning to change. In December 1970, the Clean Air Act was signed into law, granting the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency authority to regulate automotive emissions at the federal level. The Act mandated substantial reductions in hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides over the coming years. For manufacturers, this meant lower compression ratios, revised camshaft profiles, and eventually the adoption of catalytic converters. The first major emissions standards took effect in the 1971 model year, with increasingly strict limits scheduled through 1975. Simultaneously, fuel quality was changing. Leaded gasoline, which allowed for high compression ratios without detonation, was targeted for gradual phase-out beginning in the early 1970s. While full unleaded requirements would not arrive until later in the decade, manufacturers began detuning engines preemptively to ensure compatibility with lower octane fuels. Compression ratios fell sharply. Chevrolet's own big block engines dropped from ratios above 11:1 in 1970 to approximately 8.5:1 by 1972. Insurance pressures also intensified. By 1970, several major insurers had begun imposing surcharges or outright refusals for high horsepower models, particularly those marketed toward younger buyers. Although these policies varied by company and region, they contributed to declining sales of top-tier performance packages. Internal manufacturer correspondence from the period indicates that marketing departments were increasingly wary of promoting outright horsepower figures. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by an OPEC embargo, would further reshape the landscape. But even before fuel shortages emerged, the direction was clear. Large displacement, high compression engines designed solely for maximum output were becoming incompatible with regulatory and market realities. The LS6 Chevelle entered production at the last moment, when such a configuration could be offered without compromise. What makes the 1970 Chevelle SS 454 a boundary car is not simply its horsepower rating, but the combination of characteristics that followed from the rules in place at the time. It was carbureted, high compression, and tuned without regard for exhaust emissions beyond visible smoke. Its camshaft overlap prioritized airflow at high RPM rather than idle quality or emissions stability. Its ignition curve assumed access to high-octane leaded fuel. These were not features that could be gradually scaled back while maintaining the same character. Once emission standards took effect, the entire design philosophy had to change. This shift became evident almost immediately. In 1971, the LS6 was discontinued. The LS5 remained, but with reduced compression and lower output. By 1972, Chevrolet adopted SAE net horsepower ratings, which measured engines with full accessories and exhaust systems installed. The same 454 engine that had been rated at 450 horsepower gross in 1970 was now listed at approximately 270 horsepower net. While part of this drop reflected a change in measurement methodology, real output had also declined due to emissions tuning and lower compression. The Chevelle itself was reoriented. Marketing materials emphasized ride comfort, styling, and broad torque, rather than peak performance. Suspension tuning softened, axle ratios became taller, and manual transmissions grew less common. By the mid-1970s, the Chevelle nameplate would be applied to cars whose performance priorities differed fundamentally from those of the LS6 era. Other manufacturers experienced similar transitions. Chrysler's 426 Hemi disappeared after 1971. Ford's 429 Cobra Jet and Boss engines were detuned or discontinued. Across the industry, displacement remained large for a few years, but output steadily declined. Performance did not vanish, but it was redefined around drivability, compliance, and eventually efficiency. Some reports suggest that Chevrolet engineers were aware, even during development, that the LS6 represented a peak unlikely to be repeated. Internal documentation confirms that the engine was expensive to build, difficult to certify under upcoming emissions standards, and increasingly difficult to insure in the consumer market. However, there is no evidence that the LS6 was conceived explicitly as a final statement. It existed because, at that moment, the rules still allowed it. In retrospect, the LS6 Chevelle stands apart because it combined maximum engine output with minimal regulatory interference. Later performance cars would regain speed through different means: turbocharging, electronic fuel injection, computer-controlled ignition, and advanced materials. By the 1980s and 1990s, cars with smaller engines would match or exceed the LS6's straight-line performance while emitting a fraction of the pollutants. But they would do so under a fundamentally different framework, one shaped by emissions compliance, fuel economy standards, and electronic control systems. The difference is not merely technical, but conceptual. The LS6 era assumed that performance was achieved by allowing the engine to operate as freely as possible, constrained primarily by mechanical durability. After the regulatory changes of the early 1970s, performance became an exercise in optimization within limits. Engineers no longer asked how much air and fuel an engine could consume, but how precisely they could control that consumption while meeting external requirements. By tracing the Chevelle SS 454 to its moment in history, the significance becomes clear. It was not the fastest car ever built, nor the most refined. Its importance lies in timing. It was produced at the precise point when decades of permissive regulation ended and a new era of oversight began. Every performance car that followed would be shaped by that transition, whether through reduced output, altered engineering priorities, or new technologies designed to work around the constraints. When viewed this way, the 1970 Chevelle SS 454 is less a relic of excess than a reference point. It shows what performance looked like when it was defined almost entirely by displacement, compression, and airflow, before emissions standards, fuel policy, and insurance economics imposed new boundaries. The rules did not eliminate performance, but they permanently changed how it was achieved. This wasn't the end of performance, it was the end of performance as it used to exist.